Media Network proudly presents a weekly exploration of various spiritual practices with renowned spiritual authors, coaches, teachers, and Dr. Tracy Brown, RScP.
And now, here's Tracy.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown. I want to welcome you to this week's episode of Poetry, Prayer, and Practice. Oh, every week I get the opportunity to take a few minutes with you and to think about poetry and prayer and practice and what that has to do with my spirituality or my demonstration of spiritual principle. So in case this is your first time with me, then you can expect a number of things in this show and in other shows. Sometimes we focus on poetry as a spiritual practice, like writing it, or how reading poetry that others have written can inspire us or nurture us and encourage us in our way of incorporating spirituality into our lives. Prayer, there are so many different forms of prayer. And whatever form or forms you are most comfortable with, there's also a science or a technology underneath the prayer that's working. So on some shows, we really focus on prayer, what it is, how to use it, how to go deeper with it, how to be more effective, how to see it demonstrate in your life. And those are spiritual practices, but we don't limit ourselves to those. So some of you who have been around me a lot know that a big driver for me is helping people integrate their personal or mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual priorities. And that means, what kind of spiritual practices are we using, and how do we get beyond just the kind of automatic or best known as spiritual practices and really create and use spiritual practice in a way that is unique or individualized, perfect for you, for me, for each one of us. Sometimes I share the example that for me, there was a big motivation, maybe a dozen years ago now, maybe even more, inspired by Reverend Lee Wallach when he mentioned or made a comment about tithing your day in spiritual practice, the way that you tithe your financial resources to communities you love or to people who are serving and being an example and feeding you spiritually. And since then, I was like, yes, my waking hours, I'm so grateful for my life and for the opportunity to experience life that I will tithe 10% of my waking hours to spiritual practice. And it's not so hard to do once you actually have committed to doing it. But that's why this show is poetry, practice, poetry, a prayer, and spiritual practice. And today's guest, wow. Now, I have known Reverend Cliff Rubin for a nice amount of time, more than a decade. And what's really interesting is there are so many different things I could talk about with Cliff Rubin. And some of you may remember that he was scheduled to be a guest on this show a few weeks ago. If you're watching this in real time, he was a scheduled guest in July, and we're recording this in August, and he had to cancel his time, and we're going to talk about why. So I'm really glad to have him back, because I can't think of anyone who I would rather talk about using spiritual practice in a way that matters than Cliff Rubin. So I'm going to tell you three things that I know about Cliff Rubin, and then we're going to bring him in. So one thing that I know about Cliff Rubin is that he is being a most amazing spiritual leader and minister in Edmonton, in Canada, for CSL Edmonton. Number two, Cliff Rubin spent a lot of years in New Thought being known not as a minister, but as a musician. And so, I don't know, we may get him to talk a little bit about the transition from being a singer, songwriter, musician, musical guest in the path and how that path connected him into ministry. And then the third thing that I'll share with you of the many things I know about Cliff Rubin is that he has a history of being an innovator and was one of the first, if not the first, but definitely one of the first to have a full-time, designed from the ground up virtual ministry. And this was way before COVID. So I could tell you 10 more things, but I have been talking for 8 minutes, and I think it would be better for me to just bring Reverend Cliff Rubin into the studio.
Ta-da!
Hey! So I picked 3 things out of the 30 things I could have shared about you because I wanted them to be 3 different things. But what do you want the audience to know about you, especially in the context of the conversation that we're going to have, or not?
Well, I guess the biggest thing I want them to know is that I am committed. Wow, there's an echo. And I am committed to my spiritual path, that I see myself more as somebody who shares my experience in my spiritual practice, as opposed to the title of spiritual director, minister, or any of those things. For me, it's simply I'm walking my path and sharing, what that's for, what's happened to me around that, and how it may serve others.
I think that matches because all the different things I know that you have done and are doing, that is a beautiful way to pull it all together, because no matter what it is, that's exactly what you're doing. You show up. You're one of the people I know for a fact from experience. You show up, and you show up with passion, and you show up with clarity, and you show up sharing how you are applying what you know about science of mind in general, science of mind, yes, but also metaphysics in general and other spiritual paths and spiritually related practices.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think for me, the most important thing is my own evolution. And then using that as a way of saying, this is what I did and this is what worked for me. Maybe this can work for you too.
I love that. I love that. You've done that around your health. You've done that with music. You've done that with the online ministry. And so, yeah, why would I expect anything different? Yeah. So you haven't always been in Canada.
No.
Where are some of the other places that you have lived?
Well, I was the senior minister of the CSL, the First Church of Religious Science, actually, is what they're originally called, in Burbank, California. So I was there, and then I went back to Asheville and after COVID to become the Ministry of Music for John and Barbara Waterhouse in Asheville at the CSL there.
I love it. You said I went back to Asheville because you spent a big chunk of time in Asheville before moving to California, right?
That's correct. I mean, John and Barbara were the ones who got me started down the road of science of mind to begin with. It's particularly John Waterhouse. I got divorced. Well, my wife, before I got divorced, one day my wife just packed up and left while I was out of the house, came home to find her gone, found a card she'd left, and it was a card of Dr. John Waterhouse's. She said, "You really need to go see this guy." And so I did.
Now, I didn't know that. That's interesting. That'll be an offline conversation one day, like, really? And that was a long time ago.
That was about, at this point, I'd say almost 27 years ago.
Yeah, it's like that was a long time ago. And since then, in all your journeys, you have gotten married again.
Twice.
Well, I'm thinking about the current marriage. So
yes, my current marriage, I think I finally got it right. You know, practice makes better. And I think I finally got it right. Because this one, this is my fourth marriage. And my first three, by getting to a decade, all we were doing was hanging in there. And this one has reached a decade, and I am so excited to still be with Ashley Fuller Rubin. She is an extraordinary woman and perfect for me.
Yeah, so I just didn't want to have that, like my wife walked out on me story to be the thing that's in mind, because yes, Ash Fuller Rubin is an amazing partner, and you are being an amazing partner to her. So, spiritual practice.
Yes.
So, do you want to share with people? I was careful just to say you were scheduled in the previous month and now you're here. But let's dive in. You want to share with people why you were not on the show last month?
I almost died.
No exaggeration here.
No exaggeration here. I went into septic shock. I was rushed to the hospital. In the ER, they decided I was critical and moved me to the ICU, where they had me on 2 different drugs to raise my blood pressure because it was so low. They had me on the strongest antibiotics they could find. My lungs were filling up with water, and it came to a point where they told me that if they wanted to ventilate me, because I was 5 percentage points away from dead in terms of my oxygen level. My oxygen level was at 65%, and they said that if it hit 60%, I was dead. And so they wanted to ventilate me, and I said no. I had been talking with Ash about this for at least a decade, that no ventilation, no CPR. When it's my time to go, it's my time to go. The funniest part about that is because of I was in an ICU where the top infectious disease guy in the country was running 5 studies. And all these studies ended with the words, "when ventilated." And so it was their anticipation that they were going to put me on a ventilator. So when I said no, it threw them into this whole other place of movement. So let me walk you through this step by step, because this was an extraordinary moment. It was on a Monday, about noon, when they came in and told me they needed to put me on a ventilator, and I said no. The doctor showed up, resident doctor showed up about 3:00 to explain to me that if I dropped even 5 percentage points in terms of my blood oxygen level, I would die. I said that I understood that, and that was my call. my wife, Ash, backed me up and said, this isn't something he's just coming up with now. We've been talking about this for a decade. The doctor got it. And in the moment the doctor got it, all of a sudden, everything behind him went white. It all disappeared into this white light. It was extraordinary. His face shifted into something that is indescribable. The only thing that, the way it hit me was I was looking at the face of God. I was truly at the gate. And here it was. And the invitation that I felt and the welcoming and the peace wasn't about choice, even though I certainly had choice as to whether to cross over or not. It was to understand my infinite nature. It was to understand the infinite beingness of each and every one of us. And I felt it in that moment. I felt not just my infinite nature, but everyone's. It was an extraordinary moment. Every time I talk about it.
Well, you feel it, but what I want you to hear is that listening to you, watching you, like I needed to take a deep breath too. Like, okay, all right. So then what happened, right? But I needed that breath, and I'm sure people watching needed that breath too. Like, that's a lot to take in, and to be even able to put some language to it is really challenging, because it truly is an experience that if you haven't had it, you can't really, you can imagine relating to it, you can relate to it, but you can't really capture in the English language the words to describe it.
Yeah, that's why I just call it the face of God, because it was so awestruck. And to call it the void, that is it, because it was more the all than a void. It was like everything, the infinite nature of it all. And so I really felt that in that moment. And then, and I don't know how long it lasted. I mean, just a few moments, I guess. But then I'm back in the room and I noticed that everybody had changed. The doctors, the nurses, everybody was now on a whole different gear and level, because in terms of what was happening next. And so they started experimenting, trying other drugs, doing other things. They were moving very quickly. In the meantime, I have been doing breath exercises through yogic and other spiritual practices for decades. And so I got recognized that the game was not only to not let my blood oxygen level drop 5 degrees, but to get it better. And so I started, while everybody else was doing what they were doing, studying my breath, getting deeper and deeper into the spiritual practice of simply watching my breath. And I dived into where I could visualize my lungs. I could see the air and I got to the place where I could see the blockage, the jagged edges, which is what they looked like to me, of what was stopping my air from getting into my lungs. And so once I saw that, I developed my own breathing exercise to visualize the air going around these jagged edges. And I would count how deep I could breathe in before it wasn't getting in anymore. And at first, I couldn't get past 3. But as I kept doing it, as I kept working on it, I finally got to 4, and then 5. By the time I got to 6, the respirator lady came in and said, "You're doing so well. You're up to taking in 85 to 90% oxygen now. We're going to lower you off the 100% oxygen we're giving you back to 90%. I kept at it to where I was breathing in 7, 8. When I got to 9, she came in again and said, "We're backing you off up to 80%. And I kept at it. 10, 11. By dawn, I had gotten to 12. And they lowered it down to 70%, which allowed for them not to be so concerned anymore about that I was close to not being able to take in enough breath to live. So at least that piece was handled. There were many other pieces that still need dealing with, but at least that piece was handled.
And to realize that it is possible. We say we know it's possible to influence what is going on in our bodies with spiritual practice. We say it, and there's a part of us that we believe it, but you never really know until you're in that situation where it's like your back is against the wall, or in this case, your body is in a hospital bed, and they're telling you life or, from a human perspective, life or death information. And a lot of people even tease me because I say this or something like it so much. Our spiritual practice is not designed to help us escape from the human experience. Our spiritual practices are designed to help us navigate the human experiences. And especially when people are like, well, I did my spiritual practice. Why did this happen? Or, this is bad. And I shouldn't have this problem. Like, how did I get fired from my job? Maybe I haven't been praying enough or meditating enough. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. You practice all the spiritual practices. So when things are happening and your human experience seems to be going haywire, or at least different from what you anticipated, it's not haywire, it's just part of the journey. So you practice so that you have a toolkit to use when you need it. And so no one came to you and said, oh, Cliff, maybe now you should practice breathing. Right? But after 30 years of doing spiritual practice, intuitively, you knew to watch your breath.
Yeah, there's an interesting saying in Zen. It turns out that the word in Zen for realization, for enlightenment, is the exact same word for intimacy.
Nice.
That the idea is that the more enlightened we become, the more intimate we are with our human experience, so that we get our mind out of the way and we are closer to it. One of the other things that was going on while all this was happening was they had put a catheter in me not correctly. And so the pain I was suffering every 20, 30 minutes was, for anybody who's ever had a kidney stone, knows the excruciating nature of its cutting edge and how harsh and that sharp that pain is. And I was experiencing that every 20, 30 minutes for days on end. And the only thing that got me through that was remembering to be intimate with it, to allow it, to not resist it at all, because there was no controlling it. There was no getting away from it. There was no drug. They gave me drugs, didn't touch the pain. The only thing that got me through was knowing that I could allow it, that I could get so deep into being with it And so Ash reminded me that she heard me say many times as she watched me go through that pain, soften. That the word I kept using for myself was soften, so that I didn't resist it in any way whatsoever. Spiritual practice is about being intimate with life, with every experience we have, and bringing our infinite nature to it. The more we can be with whatever's going on, not fight it, not wish it was different, the stronger we get in our foundation of knowing that this is the beauty of life. I was just thinking today how so many miraculous things happen from this near-death experience, from me almost dying in the hospital, that it was worth it. That I don't even regret going through the pain, any of it. It was totally worth it to experience the level of spiritual foundation that I have developed in myself and am able now to bring to each moment of my life. That whole idea around intimacy has just been spectacular for me.
Yeah, I wrote down the way you framed it in this last comment. Spiritual practice is about being intimate with life. And like, I know that's going to that it already resonates with me. And I know I'm going to be maybe taking that into like a journaling prompt or a poetry prompt, because there's a lot there. Yeah. And I would venture to say, while I am not inviting
No.
I'm not saying I want to have the experience that you had in order to understand that or use it. But I'm guessing really all of us have our own experiences where that is important to remember as you are going through it. And even, I know for me today, as I'm doing different spiritual practices, after we finish talking, I will be thinking about how is this practice deepening my intimacy with life.
Yes. And all the opportunities we get for that. Every time we're annoyed, upset, have anything come up that throws us off at all, it's like, this is another opportunity to get close, to allow it. There's this another Zen practice called Wu Wei, which I have incorporated dramatically into what I'm doing these days. And it's the idea of not forcing anything at all and noticing if I'm forcing. So we've got this thing going on at our center now. It's called soul's intention. This is what I've labeled it. It's soul's intention. You either the ego makes a terrible master, but a great servant. This isn't about getting rid of our ego. It's about letting it be a servant to our soul's intention and allowing that part to lead. Because when it does, and we can tell the difference really easy, if we're in struggle, if we're forcing something, if we're trying to make something happen, that's the ego. That is not allowing for soul's intention. That is not allowing for the something larger to come along, to open up to possibility that is greater than anything our ego can see. It's our smaller self that feels limited, so it struggles. It's our larger self that knows the truth, that anything is possible when we open up to that place of infinite nature.
So I know some people, not the same people I know, but some people like this or who think like this. As you were talking, I was like, yeah, you said when you're pushing and when you're efforting and when you're like, I got to make this happen, it's the ego. But I know some people who while I agree with you, they would not agree with you and me. And they would be like, no, I'm just doing God's work. No, I've got to work really hard because I got the calling and I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And I can't let anything get in my way. And so, right. And then they get all revved up. And it's like, sometimes, I mean, I get it. I get commitment. I get clarity. But I also get synchronicity and that spirit. For every 10 ways I can think of doing something, and every 100 people I can consciously go after, that spirit and the universal energy has 100 times that, 1,000 times that, knows how to reach 1,000,000 times more people than I could possibly know with my limited, appropriately limited human brain.
Yeah. Impatience is our biggest obstacle. We see our lives as short, which they are, and we want to see everything happen before we transition. And so the people who struggle and push and are committed and doing all that thing, they're really being driven by impatience because they got to have it now. I read this beautiful thing not too long ago, maybe a month or two ago, that said true spiritual maturity is when you plant a seed and you never get to, and knowing you'll never get to see the tree.
Right. I'll never get to stand under the shade.
That's right. Of that tree. It's our job to plant seeds, but then we got to let go of how they flower, how they mature, and the folks who are pushing and thinking, struggling, they're being image, in my opinion. And I don't care, if they can take it personal if they want, but I see it as spiritual immaturity.
I love that. Impatience as a sign of ego and impatience as a sign of spiritual immaturity. Wow, it's gonna take me like 6 months to unpack this part of this conversation, especially, as it relates to me, because I think that a lot of us who have done a lot of work over a long period of time get a little lazy. It's easy to get like to be on automatic. I know what works for me. And I sometimes forget that, but I am constantly evolving and I am constantly being in different experiences. But it's easy for me to kind of be on automatic. So I love it. One of the reasons I love doing this show is because as I talk with people, I get these little, like, they don't feel like assignments, but just like, oh yeah, that's really good. Let me not just think about that, but let that marinate in my own practice.
Yeah.
So clearly you didn't die, right? You said I almost died, and you gave the most amazing Sunday talk recently, a few weeks ago, after you had returned from home from the hospital. So, okay, you used the breath and you got your breath up. You use spiritual practice to dance with the pain that was happening. But then just hearing the first part, there's the human part of me that's worked in healthcare that's going, yeah, but for where you were, you should have been in the hospital for another 3 to 4 weeks. But that didn't happen that way.
No, it's just another week and I was home. Yeah. And the second part of this has, what you were just, I want to speak to something you were just saying, Tracy, which is that one thing that has occurred to me and become very clear to me is the work is simply, we lose our spiritual practice, we find our spiritual practice. We lose our spiritual practice. When you were talking about getting on automatic, that's when you lose your spiritual practice. And then you find it, and then you lose it, and then you find it. And that's the work. That's what we're all doing all the time. And, and so I had this extraordinary experience, right? Of being at the gate. I mean, talk about a peak experience. And then the next day, it's now Tuesday. I decided to stand in my sovereignty, which is when I truly listen to my soul's intention and I let that be in charge. And it said it was time for the catheter to come out. And so I told it. So this guy who was the top, infectious disease guy in the country comes walking in, and he was pleased that I was still alive. And so he's having a conversation with me. And I said, it's time to take out the catheter. And he said, no. And I reminded him that actually I have say over what is done to my body by law. And he kind of freaked out because people obviously don't speak to him that way. But in the end, and so he started to tell me about his fiduciary responsibility. But then he used a word that is one of my favorite words in the English dictionary. He used the word negotiate. I love that word. And so I perked up. I said, okay, let's negotiate. What's it going to take to have the catheter taken out? And so he then walked me through all these horrific procedures because their biggest fear was that because my kidneys had shut down, I was actually in renal failure. And so they were saying that if they pulled out the catheter, there was going to be a blockage, there was going to be all these problems. So if they did that, they'd have to do all these procedures that were way worse than just having a catheter. He was trying to, but I said, if you do all those kinds of procedures, I'll be on anesthetic, right? And he said, yes. And I said, deal. Because my higher self, my soul's intention had told me there was no blockage anyway. And so I would, but just, but if there was in my, and I was reading it wrong or whatever, this was fine. And so he was like, oh, wow, that I agreed to all that. So later that afternoon, a resident came in, reminded me of our deal. If there was a blockage, they pulled out the catheter, to my utter relief, because the pain had been going on for 3 days, every 20 minutes. And then I passed water, and then they checked me with a ultrasound. Ultrasound. And they said, it just has to be less than 100 milliliters left in your bladder. And there was nothing left in my bladder. It had completely emptied. There was no blockage. It was fine. They also took me off one of the blood pressure medications because my blood pressure was coming back. Now, I want to be clear about this. I never once prayed to be healthy. Not once. My focus was completely on my infinite nature. And that, of course, my infinite nature already knows that health, that it's already there, that all my body and parts have to do is remember something that already exists. But I never treated for health, not once. Mostly, I stayed very clear about being in peace and being my highest and best self. And that's where I stayed the whole time. That was my spiritual practice. I see people all the time going to practitioners or praying for health and praying for this. And it's like, no, man, pray for who you are, not for what you want.
I'm just like over here having a gospel church, hallelujah, amen moment. Because as you were ending, it's like, as someone who is a licensed practitioner, as someone who is a spiritual coach, having people come to me And I'm human, so I understand the human fear and the human thinking process. And when someone says to me, I want you to pray that the cancer will go away, it takes everything in me to just kind of translate that. Like it's like that's not the time to kind of give them a lecture or trying to teach them a spiritual principles class, but to translate that into, and I hear myself saying, who do you know this person to be? Right? This person is already this, or this person is an emanation of the one divine, the holy, the perfect. And I have to get in that frame of mind in order to pray from that place of knowing. And I understand it's hard for me to do. Well, it's not hard, like hard, but it is the challenge for me to do when people are talking to me from their pain and from their fear or their confusion, right? Or their doubt. If it's that challenging for me when I am actually, okay, there's some distance, I cannot even imagine how challenging it might be when you are the one, like doing it for yourself. Except for this, as I listen to you, I think, well, I guess that's why we do the work so much. So when we are in a position where it really matters, it intuitively or instinctively kicks in.
To abandon the truth in our hour of need is to not understand the truth. Ernest Holmes. I have been actually in Burbank, had that printed on the wall because that is just so important. I've seen people time and time again throw this stuff out the window when they needed it most. And I want to say this about that. 25 years ago, I would have done that too. 15 years ago, I was still in doubt and wavered. 5 years ago, I still wavered some. This was really one of my first experiences of things being this serious and me not wavering at all. It really took all these years of practice to get where I am now. So if you're not there yet, don't beat yourself up about it. I still have moments where I'm not there yet, just not this time.
Right. This time it kicked in. And so you just you just quoted Ernest Holmes, and yes, then you said it was on the wall in Burbank, which I guess if I saw something on the wall several times a week for a few years, I might have it memorized as well. But as you were saying it, I was like, you on, as someone who actually really studied page by page, chapter by chapter, what Ernest Holmes wrote, I shouldn't be surprised that you would remember that and many other quotes. Do you want to tell people about Cliff's Notes?
Well, I wrote that book, I don't know, I guess about 15 years ago now. It's been a while. No, maybe 10. I'm not sure. Yeah, 10 years ago. I'm sorry. It's about 10 years old. And the idea was to, the textbook's this thick. And so I just wanted to make it more accessible to folks. I wanted to put it in a form that made it easier and more accessible for people to get to the heart of the practice that we're talking about here. Some people call it a philosophy, some people call it a way of life, but in the end, I see it as a practice, a way of developing ourselves to become more intimate with life. That's new for me. I mean, I just read, the whole Zen thing is very new for me, but I'm loving it. And that's my newest thing is Wu Wei, Zen, I'm really finding it's. In fact, I'm teaching a class now in Edmonton called Intro to Zen. That puts it's a 4-week class that I'm putting together. How Zen works so well with science of mind and deepens it to get us that place of infinite nature.
Well, and what we know is that, right? We say science of mind, but we know that science of mind is I was going to say integration, but that's not the word. It's the presentation of those common threads that weave all of the largest religious and spiritual systems. They're common to all of them. And so it's no surprise that you can look at Zen, or you can look at Hinduism, or you can look at the Kabbalah, and from the mystical, any of the mystical traditions of the standard. You can look at Christian mystics and what they have written, and it is that beneath the surface of the dogma and the rituals, here is the message. And
here's the magic.
Right, that we think of as magic or miraculous, when really it is just the universal spiritual truth that is showing up and interacting with physical law.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. Wow. So time goes so fast. Time goes so fast. So you were back up and out and around in
a week,
less than 2 weeks.
Right. I entered the hospital on a Saturday. I was home Sunday, a week later.
And you were not
8
feeling
days. I was
well.
8 days in the hospital.
Right. And you were not feeling well for a few days before you went into the hospital.
That's true. The fever hit me on a Wednesday around midnight, and I was pretty much down and out until we went to the hospital on Saturday. But then I was home the following Sunday, and by Monday, congregants were coming over and meeting with me, and we were going for walks around the block and starting to build my strength. And then by the following Sunday, I was able to get up on stage and do my talk. And now today I'm taking my son out to Elk Island. We're going to go hiking and go see buffalo.
I love it. Well, you definitely are another example of how important it is for us to be committed to our spiritual practice.
Oh, yeah.
Not out of fear that some major thing is going to happen when we are going to need to use it, but at the same time being prepared, because our human life is moving from condition to condition to condition. And some of those conditions we're like, oh, that's the coolest thing that ever happened. And some of those conditions that's the worst thing I could never have imagined, even though a year from now, I'll know why it was so good. Right? We don't know what the condition's going to be. So I am inspired by your sharing what happened and how spiritual practice guided you through it. And I am grateful that you are willing to tell the story.
Tracy, I'm just so grateful for you, and like you said, we've known each other over a decade, and I am in awe and inspired and love you in terms of the work you bring to the world, in terms of the ways you've impacted our movement has just been extraordinary. And so I have been very thrilled that we have gotten to know each other through the years better and better. So thank you.
Always nice to have a little acknowledgement, and always nice to recognize it is the way Spirit is operating in me, as me, and through me. And what I wish for everyone in the world is that they find Spirit's voice saying, whispering, go do these things, go serve these people in this way, no matter what.
Yes.
Because when it's coming from that place, then it's right. You can do it. I can do it wholeheartedly, even when people don't understand or appreciate or like, because I'm not doing it for approval. Right. And it's still really nice to have some acknowledgement. So our time is just about up. I am going to put in the comments or in the post, I'm going to go back and add a link to Reverend Cliff's talk about how he almost died. So if you're watching and you're curious and you want to hear how he went through it in more detail, we will make that link available to you in the comments. So thanks a lot, Cliff.
It's been my pleasure.
Please take good care of yourself.
Okay, I will.
And everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation and that you are also as inspired as I am to use spiritual practice as a way to live your life, to sustain your life, to expand your life. That's what it's all about. Have some additional amazing guests coming up on the Poetry, Prayer, and Practice show. Got Reverend Elisha Christopher coming up, and Reverend Dr. Michelle Medrano, and Reverend Sunshine Michelle Coleman later this month. So if you're watching the recording, please go and check out these guests or guests from previous weeks by visiting New Thought Media Network on either Facebook or on YouTube. That's this week's show. My name is Tracy Brown. Thanks for joining us for Poetry, Prayer, and Practice.
Thanks for watching. Join us again next week, or watch on demand at www.ntmedia.org or youtube.com/newthoughtmedianetwork. New Thought Media Network, positively inspiring. Learn more at www.ntmedia.org.